joining. I know it's Hi everyone, thanks so much for joining. I know it's the evening in the UK, you've just finished your classes and you're probably not wanting to sit through a lecture. So that's why I'm hoping that we'll have more of a back and forth. My name is Zahra Hankir. I am a Lebanese journalist and author of Syrian and Egyptian ancestry. And I very much focus my work on the Arab world. I've been a journalist for over 12 years now. I've worked both locally in Lebanon on geopolitical developments there, as well as the aftermath of the 2006 war and a string of assassinations. And I also worked in Dubai during the Arab Spring, in which I covered multiple economies across the Arab world in the aftermath of the Arab Spring and how they were then affected. And of course, the roots of the Arab Spring are very much economic. So there is a lot of intersectionality in my coverage as well. So I wanted to actually start by discussing Ukraine. I mean, obviously this is happening right now. It's impossible to kind of look away from it. And because I focus a lot of my coverage on conflicts in the Middle East and the Arab world and how they are then covered in the Western world, I thought this would be a good place to start the discussion. My day job is as a news curator, so I spend pretty much all of my days reading a lot about this conflict from a variety of news sources across the Western world, primarily in US media. And I think the first thing that struck me with this coverage was how it focused so heavily on the US and UK and EU reaction, the geopolitical dynamics. And we very rarely heard the Ukrainian perspective, right? So the voices were kind of drowned out in the beginning, which is natural. I think, obviously governments are preoccupied with geopolitical developments, but then with conflicts and invasions and then wars, obviously the voice of the local, in my opinion, is the most important voice. So whether that is the voice of people who are suffering the fallout from the conflict itself, or the voices of the journalists who are actually on the ground, who are Ukrainian, who are delivering that news story. So, I would want to pose this question to you. How often do you look at the bylines of the coverage that you are consuming on a daily basis when it comes to Ukraine? Are you seeking out Ukrainian voices? Is this something that you are thinking about structurally in your approach? For me, when I'm reading news on any conflict, I'm intentionally and very strategically seeking out local voices, because in my experience as an Arab woman who has lived through conflicts in the Arab world and also has connections to the West, I was born in the United Kingdom and very much understand the Western media landscape. I also understand that when these conflicts happen, what tends to occur within Western media is foreign correspondents will be sent to the ground to cover these particular conflicts, right? Because suddenly this is an area of great interest. So a group of foreign correspondents will be sent from the major mainstream media outlets to cover these conflicts. And often they do great work and they risk their lives to bring us that news. And, I always give credit where credit is due. But sometimes that structural framework can skew conflicts in a way that the tone can be slightly less focused on the local perspective and more focused on whatever the national media conversation is driving. So in the case of the US, it would be Biden's strategy and so on. So, I'm not necessarily wanting to criticize that approach. I'm saying we should have a more inclusive approach where we are thinking of local voices, local perspectives, where we are centering those voices, where we're making them the most important voices in our coverage, and also where we're very much focusing on the suffering of the people. And that's something that I push for in the Arab world, and very much through my book, which you may or may not have heard of. It's Our Women on the Ground, Essays by Arab Women Reporting from the Arab World. This was published in the US and the UK in 2019, and it's a collection of essays by Arab women journalists across the region in which they discuss their personal experiences covering war. And then I really want to say the reasons why it's important as well to focus on local voices and to question the narratives that we're receiving from mainstream media. And we have actually seen already problems with the narrative on Ukraine in the coverage of different communities or ethnic groups who are trying to flee Ukraine. In the mentioning of the refugees, Ukrainian refugees being more relatable to Europeans because they're white or they have blue eyes. This is actual wording that has been used in mainstream media, and also that these are more civilized people as compared to, let's say, Afghan refugees, Syrian refugees, Iraqi refugees, and conflicts in other areas of the world, including Yemen. And these are ongoing conflicts. And this is so important to really understand what is driving this tonal framing. And my feeling is this is an extension of Orientalism. I'm sure you're all here familiar with Edward Said, who is one of my literary and political heroes, that this is essentially an extension of racism, an extension of Orientalism, in which we are prioritizing certain communities over others because they may be more relatable to, let's say, the Euro-centric mainstream media and the people who consume that media. So that's all. These are also questions that I continue to ask in my work, and I would ask also other people to ask that question as well when they're consuming this news. And of course, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be, sympathetic to all groups. The idea is that we need to be very careful in the wording and the framing as journalists and as foreign correspondents, and that's something that I've committed my most of my career to, is to thinking about the framing in Western media and tropes and stereotypes that have been pushed, sometimes inadvertently, and the lack of questioning of that dominant narrative. And that is actually what led me to putting together this book. I had, personal experiences at various Western media companies where I would question the coverage, or where I was sidelined, where my voice was not taken seriously as compared to someone who, didn't know the language, didn't know the region. Often senior editors are the ones who are calling the shots. So even if you start to see more and more bylines from people of color in newsrooms, or from Middle Easterners or Arabs or whatever ethnic group, oftentimes, even though they are at these companies and you see more of their bylines, they're not calling the final shots. So that's another structural problem or dynamic that I'm pretty preoccupied with in my work. For the book, I really wanted to celebrate and amplify the voices of women in the Middle East doing this work, because they often risk their lives. They're often going through grief, PTSD, trauma based on the developments that they're witnessing. I did want to actually read a sentence from one of the essays that continues to really resonate with me. This is by Zahra Hankir. The essay is Hurma, which is a derogatory way of saying woman in Arabic. She says here, the journalistic norm of keeping a distance with your sources is to me an abstract concept, as removed from reality as living alone on an island. My sources are my schoolmates, relatives, and family members, and those death counts flashing on your screens contain my first lovers, teachers, neighbors, and friends. So this is, for me, such a relatable paragraph, because she really captures that this is a personal story for her that she's covering, and the lengths to which she's going to bring that news to people. And yet she is still very objective in the work that she's doing, right? But it affects her on a very personal level. She's now living in exile in London, and has gone on to do a lot of training for young journalists who are covering conflicts. And it's just, that's the sort of, I think, personal nature that we're dealing with when we are covering our homelands, right? Where we're not sent in as a foreign correspondent to parachute in and cover a conflict and then to leave it, right? We are actually writing about, what's happening in our homeland, in our hometowns. And a lot of the times, the Western correspondents who are sent to do this work and who do very good work, again, this is not necessarily to critique all of this work, is that they'll go into that region, do the work for maybe months or a couple of years on a stint, and then will return to their countries because, obviously they have the privilege of a passport, and they will go on to write a memoir, or they will become sort of authoritative figures in a particular conflict, and they will write nonfiction books on particular conflicts, and they'll be celebrated for it. And my feeling constantly was that, why don't we celebrate the locals who are doing this work and who are going to these lengths and risking their lives and the lives of their families to bring us this news? And even more so the women journalists, because they're up against multiple challenges. My feeling is that we need to celebrate and amplify. And I do feel in retrospect that this book has been a success, because I feel like, I often get messages from young women across the Arab world who say that they're inspired by the women in the book and that they want to pursue careers in journalism themselves. And I also get a lot of messages from people, outside of the Arab world, saying that the book has deepened their understanding of a region in a way that other books haven't, because they're telling the stories of, the personal stories of these women who are bringing us this work in a way that the modern history of the region perhaps has not been told. Of course, there are many other books that do this, but perhaps not with this very specific lens, which is a collection of essays from women all across the region, of different generations, of different nationalities, of different religious backgrounds, different types of journalists as well. So my feeling is that the book hopefully presents a kind of a very layered narrative on the region, and that will at the same time allow us to really question structural disparities in media, in mainstream media, as we consume content on various conflicts across the world. I know that was a lot. I'm just wondering if anyone has questions. I'm happy to continue freestyling, but if anyone has questions, please jump.
It's not really a question as such, but when you asked about whether, we ourselves would look at reporters on the ground from the area during times of conflict, like in Ukraine, it made me think that as a language student, we are always encouraged to go and find local newspapers and local news outlets. So I'm really good at doing that with Arabic, with Middle Eastern conflicts, for example, or even just like current news in the Middle East. I'll be reading local newspapers, and the same with Spain and South America, but it's really isolated to that, and for whatever kind of ignorant reason I haven't applied that to other current affairs. So that's really made me think about now my approach to Ukraine, for example. But you can apply it to so many other things, even if it's just reading local news. It doesn't have to be a massive event. You're definitely going to have a much more in-depth perspective from looking at it from an actual local writing from the ground, where they are, where they live, where they've grown up, what's going on.
I love that you mentioned the like local newspaper angle too, because obviously, yes, they are the closest to the story. Oftentimes with coverage in the US, when there are breaking news stories out of particular towns or states, we in my day job as a news creator, we tend to seek out local voices as well. So the diversity extends beyond just ethnic groups and nationalities. It does also go to, what region is this person reporting from? What is their beat? What is their area of expertise? And seeking that out too. Or also just simply questioning the byline of, whatever you're, not necessarily questioning it, I think being cognizant of it, right? Being aware that this is a reporter who's gone into Ukraine, who may not necessarily have the same insight as reporters in Ukraine who've been covering the Russia-Ukraine conflict for years, right? It's not that hard, actually. You just usually have to do a basic Google search, like Ukrainian journalists or journalists to follow. Oftentimes there are people put together lists of people to follow on Twitter, for example. If you're not able, if there are linguistic barriers for conflicts around the world, there often will be English speaking people from those specific countries, and they will have Twitter accounts and they'll be very active. Also, citizen journalists are really important to follow too, people who are actually on the ground. Of course, you also have to question the veracity of some, there's a lot of information out there, but I think the idea is that you just want to be aware that there are many different sources, and my feeling is we should prioritize the local sources whilst also getting news from others. I mean, I can think of, for example, Lise Doucette for the BBC. She does exceptional foreign reporting, and she's actually in Ukraine right now, and she does a lot of what I'd mentioned before, which is that she focuses on the suffering of the people and so on. So I could, for example, watch Lise Doucette or read Lise Doucette, but also be reading the work of Ukrainians as well. And again, I would extend that also to the Middle East. I think with the Middle East, and obviously I touched on this earlier, and this is, you know, slightly, it's not necessarily controversial, but this is an area that needs to be spoken about more, is that you do see a difference in tone. You do see a difference in the amount of coverage that you may be getting out of, for example, Syria right now or Yemen right now versus Ukraine, when those conflicts are ongoing and the death tolls are continually rising. And that is about Western interests, right? It's about what conflict is the West in this current moment in time primarily interested in. And that's another area where you have to question what you're consuming and why. Why are you seeking out news on this conflict, right? And again, it's really not to say that one is more important than the other. It's just to question that structural framing of like how the news right now is framing this is the most important conflict, right? So these are questions that I think are important to ask, and particularly I think as students at AIMS too. Is that how you pronounce it, AIMS? Great. Does anyone have any questions? Anyone other than Anna? No.
Somebody sent in a question that isn't necessarily related to what we've just covered.
Let me see
but
that.
It's a question nonetheless. I can just get it up. She unfortunately couldn't be here today. But so she's also an Arabic student, and she was wondering about whether writing in Arabic kind of changes the way that you think than if you were to be writing in English, whether there's any kind of linguistic differences between the two.
I mean, there are huge linguistic differences between the languages, which I won't necessarily get into now. But I think this is a really good question because it gets to the idea of audience. Who are you really writing for when you're writing in English? When you're writing in Arabic, you're very much addressing the audience in the Arab world, and that may impact let's say the detail that you may be delivering. You may be more careful with the language because of, the media is very polarized in the Arab world. It's really difficult to generalize, but it's, the risks are very high for journalists in the Arab world covering conflicts there. Whereas obviously if you're writing in English and perhaps you may be living in exile, you may not be living in the Arab world, or you may have that distance that allows you to write in a way that you might not write in Arabic for the Arab audiences. At the same time, I do think writing in English, there's a lot of filtering that goes on, depending on the, let's say, publication or media outlet that you are writing for. There's a lot of filtering, there's a lot of framing issues, and therefore, in some ways, writing in English can be freeing. But in other ways, it can also be limiting. And I would say the same to writing in Arabic too, writing for an Arab audience. I mean, one thing that has continued to frustrate me with my book, and the subject of audience came up a lot with my book, is this book for a Western audience? My feeling always was that this book is for a global audience. First and foremost, I want everyone and anyone to feel like they can read this book. This book was never put together to cater to a Western audience, although I do acknowledge the issues in Western media coverage, as I've spoken about at the beginning of this talk. I hoped that we would find a publisher that would publish this in Arabic. Unfortunately, we were not able to, because the essays were deemed by many of these publishing houses to be too controversial for publication in the Arab world. So that has been an ongoing issue for me that I've been quite disappointed by. We did get an offer from an Israeli publisher to publish the book, but we had to pass on that for multiple reasons, including legal. So yeah, that's, audience is something I think about a lot, and I appreciate that question because I think it directly ties to that idea of audience as well. Any questions?
I think Yaz has a question.
I have a question. Yeah, so essentially, how do you navigate the world of journalism changing with social media becoming such a big way of people sharing and getting their news? Because now it kind of seems like people want the whole news story either in an Instagram like infographic or in a 30 to 60 second soundbite. So basically, just how do you kind of traverse that new way of spreading knowledge, especially in stories that should take up more space and more time?
Yeah, this is a really good question, and it's difficult, because if you have a very layered story and you have news consumers scrolling through their feeds on social media, a news publisher will probably want to catch the attention of the person, right? And you need to deliver pithy information to them that's digestible, but also nuanced, which is difficult to do in a social media packaging, but I do think that you can at least pique the interest of the person who is consuming the content, and then hope that they would go on to read more or learn more. And you can do that with striking imagery. You can do that with striking infographics. You can then lead the reader to the actual article or the video that may give them more context. I do think it's limiting, and I do think people also, I continually advocate for following citizen journalists and consuming their content as well. But I would also, urge caution there too, because there's so much misinformation as well. So, on the journalism side, I think exploring different forms of packaging content to appeal to different audiences is key. And a lot of these media outlets are going in that direction. So they're becoming much more visual. They have TikTok accounts, they constantly put out Instagram stories, and then they also have links that would hopefully encourage the user to go to follow that link to learn more. But yes, I mean, it's difficult. There's no easy answer to this. I think you have to tread very carefully too, that you would pique the interest of the reader whilst also doing some form of justice to the story. Is difficult to do, but I think publishers I think we're in an experimental phase actually for news publishers around the world with this, and some are much better than others for sure. But thank you, Yas. Is your name Yasmin?
No, it's Yasnia.
Okay. my sister's name is Yasmin, and we call her Yas for short. Any questions?
I've had one sent through by someone that's basically asking whether you got into the field of journalism because you saw that, for example, at Woman, there was this group of people that were often overlooked, or whether it's something that you became interested in as you became a journalist and you wanted to advocate for these voices that are often ignored being heard.
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I mean, it's a combination of those two things. My parents fled Lebanon during the Lebanese Civil War, and I was born in the UK. And I grew up in a household that had the news on constantly because my parents were closely following the Civil War. It was a brutal civil war that went on for 15 years. And at the time, phone lines were down. My parents didn't have a way to contact their family. Social media wasn't a thing. So they relied heavily on news. And my dad used to record the news. He just used to, with actual VHS, video cassettes. We don't know why he did it. He just almost wanted to obsessively document what was going on. So he would just record everything. And as a child, and seeing this imagery and knowing that this was my homeland, these images are actually showing me what's happening in my country of origin, that drew me to news, because I felt very much so that these journalists were heroes. They were giving us the news and they are heroes. But often, and this wasn't until I was older, I realized that I thought of heroes as being white men who worked for the BBC, because that's all I saw, and it wasn't until really I became older and I started to ask these structural questions about who delivers the news and why and who's the audience, that I felt much more drawn towards local sources and local communities. And after I moved back to Lebanon, we moved back when the war subsided a couple of years after that. I was always wanting to be a journalist. I was always wanting to be a journalist, and realizing also consuming the media there, how different the approach was to the news. And then I became the editor-in-chief of my student newspaper at the American University of Beirut. And really the rest is history. I mean, the newsroom was primarily, it was dominated by women, really tenacious women, you know, at a time when it was mostly men who commanded the narrative, really. But we just had the really incredibly tough women in the newsroom asking the toughest questions and doing tough work and really reflecting what was going on a national level. And then I think the idea for the book came to me during the Arab Spring, which was when all of these structural questions that I mentioned earlier really came to light at the time. And there was a huge discrepancy in the way the story was being covered on the ground across the Arab world. And again, I do not discount the fact that media is very polarized there and can be quite problematic, but it was very much focused on, a lot of the coverage was focused on the suffering of the people and understanding, you know, what was happening through the voices of the people. And then also knowing that so many of these journalists were Arab women and risking their lives to bring us the story. And at the same time, seeing all of these Western journalists doing this work and being celebrated so much to no end. Their voices were amplified. And I was like consuming this news, you know, knowing that there was this discrepancy, right, in how we treat the narrative and how we treat the people giving us the story. So it was a combination of really of noticing that discrepancy, wanting to correct it in some way and not really knowing how, and thinking, okay, a good way to do this would be to package it through this book. I mean, the beginning, I thought maybe a podcast would work. You know, I didn't set out to put together a book. That idea came to me much later. And then, you know, also in publishing, there are huge discrepancies in publishing with, you know, who gets to tell the stories of particular regions or peoples. Like there's no shortage of books on Arab women written by, you know, Western white women, you know. I'm like, well, how about we hear about Arab women through their own voices and experiences, right? And yeah, I hope that answers the question. So it's a combination of factors. But I would say it's to celebrate and to amplify, whilst also recognizing structural problems and wanting to correct them or advocate for making changes and diversifying newsrooms and having more representation for particular communities.
Perfect. Has anyone else got any more questions for the time being?
Yeah, hi. I've got a question.
Hi, Elliot.
Hi. I was just wondering what you'd perhaps suggest, as obviously I'm quite privileged in my position as being straight white, a straight white man. How I can use that privilege, or how I can use that to support kind of female on the ground journalism, like how I could help to correct perhaps the structural problems that you just mentioned.
I appreciate that question very much. Thank you for, you know, for recognizing that and speaking up. I think firstly, you've done the most important thing, which is recognize your privilege. And I think in the context of journalism or consuming content about particular conflicts around the world, whether or not it's journalism, whether it's on social media or through the news, it would be really to seek out these diverse voices, and secondly, to amplify them in whatever way you can. So depending on the tools you have, I don't know what you're going to go on to do with your career, but I think the idea is always, where possible, to hand over the mic or to ensure that you, where you can, are amplifying the voices of people who are knowledgeable. I do that myself. Okay, so I'll give you an example. I was invited to a very prestigious literary festival in the UK and asked to speak on Saudi women. And I felt completely out of place because I'm not a Saudi woman. I'm an Arab woman, but I don't represent all Arab women, you know. So I actually told the organizers, here's a list of names of Arab women. Perhaps you should get in touch with one of those women, you know. So it's all about sort of recognizing where you fall structurally, and then where you can, passing on the mic and moving to the side and ensuring that, you know, the staying in your lane where possible, and then ensuring that other people are getting the attention where they need the attention and where they deserve the attention. It can be easier said than done. But I can think of multiple examples in my job as a journalist throughout my career where I was sidelined and white men were actually promoted instead of me. This actually happened to me at a major news media company. I was, horrified at it, and I believed myself to be far more qualified than this person who didn't know Arabic and didn't know the Middle East at all. And I was being told that I was not at that level. And it took me a long time to actually speak out about that and to understand why that had happened. But I think that that sort of a decision, while it happens on the higher levels at certain companies, you can also show allyship. If you are in a company like that and something like that happens, you can show allyship. You can, if you reach a position of power, you can ensure something like that doesn't happen. So I know this is a lot, and it also really depends on what you choose to do with your career. But I would hope that, these are things that you would question and then prioritize as you work with other people. Does that help, Elliot?
Yeah, thank you.
Great. Anyone else? I mean, I actually was going to bring up an example of a situation. Oh, sorry, Anna, were you going to say there's a question?
I think, I don't want to be calling Katie out, but I think that Katie may have had a question.
Oh, great, please shoot.
Yeah, okay. Sorry, I just got your book here, so I'm
great.
So I think a lot of us on this call do Middle East studies, but obviously recently there's been quite a lot of contestation over using the term Middle East, because it has very Orientalist perspectives, and so there's been a lot of talk about other terms we can use instead, such as Swana, which is Southwest Asia and Northern Africa. Do you have an opinion on sort of the terms that we can use to maybe be more appropriate?
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing this up, because I actually address it in my book. We chose to use Arab world in the book, although we do interchangeably use that with Middle East and North Africa, with the knowledge, of course, that, that is sort of like an imperial colonial term to use, especially with the way the Middle East was carved up. And then Arab world, also within the Arab world, or the countries in the Arab League that are classified as Arab, many communities from some of those countries do not identify as Arab at all, right? Because you have different groups in various contexts. So it's actually a very complicated question. And I didn't have an easy solve for it at the time. We couldn't use Middle East and North Africa on the cover of the book. Let me just say that, because it would have been too many words. But I opted also for Arab world because of the linguistic and cultural ties between the various countries, and the shared culture, but recognizing at the same time that even that is a problematic way to frame the region, considering I was actually trying to illustrate in the book that this is a very diverse and layered region, and it's not a homogeneous region, and we should be limiting people. At the same time, I personally am okay with delineating a geographical area and saying this is the area. And that is why I would say actually Swana is probably the term that I would advocate for. And I think going forward in my own work, I'd probably use that myself, just because it really, it describes the region in sort of a non-Eurocentric way, or non-religious or non-political. And that's the assumption with the usage of the term. And that for me is probably what I would personally use going forward. So I very much appreciate the question. I don't think it was widely used when my book came out. And I don't even think today it's widely recognized. I see Nancy. Nancy's my colleague, probably hasn't heard of it. I mean, it's not something that people who don't follow the region would know of, but perhaps you popularize it with time, and people learn that the other terminologies can have problematic Orientalist framings. But I'm glad you guys are thinking about this. This is an excellent question to be asking. Appreciate that very much.
Thank you.
Of course.
I just have one more question, if that's okay, about whether there's kind of been a rise in media outlets or perhaps companies employing white women and thinking that is enough for their kind of diversity, or whether there's been an increase in white women thinking that because they are female, they have a kind of right to talk about your situation as an Arab woman. Because I've seen lots of interviews of, white women saying that, for example, wearing the hijab goes against feminism, and Muslim women shouldn't be told that they have to wear the hijab. So their solution is to tell Muslim women that they shouldn't wear the hijab, which is obviously very hypocritical.
I mean, I have to say, I so appreciate this question. It's probably one of the best questions I've had in the past few months, because it really hits the nail on the head. I mean, for me, it's always like you want to be going to the Arab woman herself, okay? And speaking for Arab women is deeply problematic in so many ways. At the same time, I do think it's important that there are more women in the field who are doing this work. I mean, I'm not about to tell you like, oh, it's better to have a white man over a white woman. You know what I mean? Like, I think it's better that we have more women doing this work, but I do not think this is a band-aid. I do not think that just because we have more white women for particular media organizations doing this work, that suddenly we think this is great. I'm not going to name names, but there is a major media outlet that has just promoted a white woman to become the Middle East bureau chief. Okay. And that person will be based in Tel Aviv. They're not an Arab woman. This is problematic on so many levels. Okay, great, you're sending a woman over, but how many Middle Eastern women did you have to sideline to give this position to that person? This person does not know Arabic. I know this for a fact. This person does not know the region in the way that these Arab or Middle Eastern women or Swana women know the region. Why are you therefore promoting this person to this position? These are questions we need to be asked. As I said, we need to ask. As I said, we need to go back to the structural issue. So the structural issue is always that people at the very top, the people who are calling the shots, are actually not Arab or people of color or Black or brown or Asian or, whatever ethnic community, right? It's usually white men or white women. More white women, great. But again, we still need to be questioning things more holistically. And the last thing that I would do personally is read an account of Middle Eastern women written by a white woman. I would also recommend a book written by Rafia Zakaria called White Feminism. I don't know if that's the title of the book. Oh, it's called Against White Feminism, which covers some of what you mentioned, Anna. It's almost an extension of this like white savior behavior, right? To write about other communities as if you are doing that community a great favor by doing that. So she very much touches on that in that book. So I would recommend that. And I hope that answers your question. And I hope also that I don't sound like I'm alienating anyone in this group, because I know that, there are people who do this work and they do it very well and they do it with empathy. But I still think we need to question these structural issues that I've mentioned.
No, that really answered the question. Thank you.
Great. So I did want to give an example actually of a situation in which there were instances where a very famous journalist at the New York Times, her name is Rukmini Callimachi, she was putting together a podcast called Caliphate, which I don't know if any of you have listened to, but it was like one of their biggest podcasts, most listened to podcasts. And there were instances in which she did not listen to Arabs who were telling her to question some of her sourcing. This is well documented. It has been written about by the New York Times. I'm not making any inferences. It's been written about by other publications too, that this is what happened. And then that led to a correction for this podcast where a few episodes, I think one of the episodes was withdrawn, and then they had an appended correction from the executive editor himself. And essentially the main source of that podcast, who was a Canadian man a Muslim Canadian man, I believe of Pakistani origin, had claimed that he had gone to Syria to fight with ISIS. So the entire premise of this podcast was that you would be getting this inside story of what happened, right? When Muslim men living in the West were radicalized. And you were getting that story, and you were getting all the details. And there were some grisly details that he gave. And his word was treated almost as truth. I want to say almost, because there is an episode in which she does question him a little bit. The reporter does question him. But ultimately, this man was then jailed, or I think he was arrested. I don't know if he's actually gone to prison, because it was a hoax. He had made the whole thing up, and Canadian authorities and then ended up questioning him for this purpose. This is hugely problematic, because this is one of the biggest media companies in the world, and most respected media companies in the world, that had trusted the reporting of a journalist who had been questioned by people who were closer to the story, and then whose reporting was put out as fact, right? And then the whole thing ends up being a hoax. Listen, it's a great listen. Like, it's very compelling if you were to believe that this was true. But I think also the reason why there was so much interest or excitement in believing this to be true is also trying to understand, like, what was happening in the mind of this person. How are Muslims radicalized? Tell us more about these barbaric Muslims, you know? And that might sound like a little bit reductive on my part, but I do genuinely feel that this does exist as a perception, that like, this is what happens to radicalized Muslims, and we want to go into their mind and understand why. There's that appetite, right? And that's why the podcast was so popular, when in fact this was all actually literally made up. And that's problematic. I think structurally, if you had Arabs at the highest levels of that company, that podcast wouldn't have, you know, been published. And since, as I've said, the New York Times itself has acknowledged the problematic content of that podcast and issued a major correction, and certain awards that were won by the journalist were retracted. And then this was also actually following a situation in which there were, I think, hundreds of documents, ISIS documents, that were found in Iraq, that this journalist and her team seized and took out of Iraq and brought to the United States, which then led to questions of, you know, why did you not give those documents to the Iraqi authorities? Why are you taking the documents out yourself? So these, again, are structural issues. I do believe later on that the New York Times returned those documents or issued a correction. I'm not 100% on, but not a correction, or issued some sort of an acknowledgement that the files shouldn't have been taken. Not 100% sure of that. But these are really important questions that we should be asking when we are approaching any news story, where we have to be kind of aware that there may be some bias that is leading that particular reporter to pursuing a particular story, and not scrutinizing the story or listening to people surrounding her who may be more knowledgeable about that story. So I just wanted to really give that as an example of why it can be problematic to rely on the account of a particular reporter without scrutinizing it and assuming it to be true, especially when it comes to covering communities of color or conflicts around the world. This is something we should be scrutinizing ourselves. Anyone have any questions on that?
I guess there's been lots of coverage lately, obviously, about the Russia-Ukraine conflict, but there's been a lot as well online about the difference between how it's been covered in comparison to, for example, the Israeli occupation of Palestine, and how there's been, for example, Ukrainians being called freedom fighters, whereas Palestinians being called, I mean, at the extreme, being called terrorists when they're fighting for the same thing, really. And I just wondered what your opinion is on that kind of difference between how it's covered in the media.
Yeah, I mean, this is an ongoing issue. Coverage of Palestine across Western media is one of the biggest red lines, I think, for journalists to cross. And this has actually been written about. There's a PhD student, or no, I think she was a master's student at MIT, who ran a study of headlines that cover the Palestine-Israel conflict, that show that the language used when it comes to Palestinians is particularly problematic, because it frames the Palestinians as aggressors, even if the death toll is clearly hugely Palestinian. I mean, most deaths are usually Palestinian in these conflicts, but still the wording of the headlines will indicate in some way that there was some fault on the Palestinian side that led to the aggression. I do actually want to use this very specific example that really stands out to me, in which the situation in Sheikh Jarrah, which I'm sure many of you have read about, was referred to as gentrification, right? As opposed to settler colonialism, or however you would like to refer to that, or the expansion of illegal settler activity and so on. Again, the language is very important. So if you use a word like gentrification, this minimizes the plight of the Palestinians themselves. And to use these words, to use this language, to me, I think is not innocent. I feel that strongly about the language around Palestine and Israel, that it is so sensitive, and yet newsrooms continue to advocate for using particular phrases over others, or framing deaths in a way that will make it seem like Palestinians are somehow complicit in this sort of aggression, or they asked for it somehow, right? And again, I think this is a red line. And I think that actually the latest conflict, there was a lot of conversation around this language. So at least people have started to talk about it and realize that. I don't know if any of you follow Mohammed al-Kurd, but he is a really fantastic Palestinian writer and journalist who constantly calls out the media for this. And I believe he writes for The Nation now. And I still think it's going to continue to be this way for quite a while. I don't think that there's an easy solve for this, because I think the biases are so deep and very inherent, and they go to, the state level, and it, it starts at the state, and then it's kind of filters through. And the media has been, I would say, complicit over the years in creating this narrative that a Palestinian who fights for resistance is certainly not a freedom fighter. He is an aggressor, and therefore, again, deserving of his fate. And we see this, we see this kind of narrative in other areas against other communities, right? Where the framing is such that, you may read the story, and if you're not knowledgeable of what is happening, you may come away from that story thinking, oh, well, the police were justified in doing that, right? And there's a couple of instances, actually, I think recently, where there was a Palestinian American man who was killed in Israel. He was beaten to death while held in custody, and he hadn't done anything. And then the framing, or the way the headlines were written about his death, were very much kind of implying that he didn't actually die at the hands of these soldiers. He kind of like had a heart attack and accidentally died, like he wasn't killed, right? He died while held in custody. So again, these words are really important. The way that we frame the conflict is really important. There are very few Arab journalists who comfortably will speak out about this, especially if they're employed by Western media. That's really important to note. And there was actually a piece that cited a lot of Arab and Middle Eastern journalists off the record, saying that they felt pressured by their newsrooms and their editors to write about the conflict in a particular way, or their work was edited. And again, that takes me back to what I said at the beginning, is that we still have structural problems in newsrooms. So even if you see bylines, or Arab bylines, or more and more Arabs doing this work, you also still have to realize that they may still be beholden to what their editors are deciding, or what the newspaper itself is deciding. There's a lot there. I hope that kind of answers your question, Anna.
No, I understand. It's a very, very big topic to try and cover in only a few minutes, but thank you. That's really interesting.
Yeah, of course.
Does anyone have any more questions? We've got about 5 minutes left.
I've just got one that, sorry, I haven't been here for all of the talk, so this may have been asked already. Apologies if it has been. I was just going to ask. Oh, sorry, I seem to have remuted myself. I was just going to ask, whether your book focuses mostly on Arab women changing the face of journalism in the West, or and beyond that, whether you think Arab women's involvement in journalism is better represented in the West as opposed to in the Arab world, or Swana, or the MENA, and which one is developing more rapidly or in a better direction?
Thank you, Patrick. That's a really good question. I certainly think that over the past 2-3 years, far more Arab women have been promoted or hired by major Western media outlets than previously. And in the UK, you have a great example. It's Rula Khalaf, who is the first female editor of the Financial Times, first non-white, first non-British, I believe. And she actually has a chapter in the book. So, when you have, the structural problems that I mentioned before remain, but you still have these strides forward, right? So right now, the New York Times has Jane Arraf as their Iraq bureau chief. And she also has an essay in my book. This is hugely positive. And a lot of these women are also winning awards, significant awards, such as Pulitzers and so on. This does not indicate necessarily that enough has been done. I still think more needs to be done, but I do think that these women collectively together are shaping the narrative in a way that has never been done before, just because you have so many more women in these newsrooms who are pitching stories that perhaps would not have been published before. So I would say, yes, I like that you brought this to the title of the talk, that yes, they are changing the face of journalism, and specifically Western journalism when it comes to coverage of the Middle East. Now, it's a much more difficult question for the region because there are so many countries in the region, and depending on which geographical title we'll use, but the reason why I think these women are particularly brave is because they are writing about a region that lags the rest of the world when it comes to women's rights, and it also has the lowest press freedoms in the world as well. So they're up against those two barriers. So I don't want to, and I never turn away from the question of how difficult it is for women in the Middle East to be doing that kind of journalism. That said, the book does demonstrate, particularly through the local journalists who were in their countries at the time of the Arab Spring and covering the conflicts, that they were turning their attention to stories that were being ignored, particularly pertaining to women and the struggles that they were enduring at that time. One example is Iman Hilal. She's an Egyptian photojournalist who was having experienced sexual assault and harassment herself. She then decided to turn her focus to sexual assault and harassment during the Arab Spring and the revolution in Egypt and the aftermath of that. And these were things that were happening while women were out and protesting, and she was experiencing that herself, and she decided she wanted to document it, and she writes a very moving chapter about that. And in a way, by focusing on the plight of women in that way, in the Arab world, when the media was focusing on, let's say, the political developments, she was focusing on women's, I hate the phrase women's issues, but she was focusing on issues pertaining to women, which is just another way of saying women's issues. And then Hiba Shibani in Libya, she's another journalist who has an essay in my book. She was prevented from covering how polarizing the situation was in Libya. She was facing harassment whenever she did cover the conflict. And she then decided, okay, well, if you're not going to allow me to do this sort of reporting, she also then decided to turn her focus, her attention towards issues that Libyan women were facing at the time. One of the stories being that they couldn't pass their nationality along to their children. Zainab Hayem was doing this, the Syrian woman. She was taking her camera into gynecological clinics during the Civil War, and she was telling the story of women and the situations that they were facing in that context. So I do believe also that they are changing journalism in the Arab world as well through the stories that they're telling, by highlighting the issues that women are facing, whether it's sexual assault, whether it's not having equal rights, and other multiple issues across the region, depending on which country you're looking at. So I would say, yes, they're changing journalism in both areas, and they're not without challenges in both areas as well. I hope that wraps up. Thanks for the question, Patrick.
Do I have any final questions just to finish off on? No, I think that was a very good last question because, like you said, it related back to the actual title for the talk. So that's a very good one to end on.
It is.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting and it's been recorded. So I will send it over to you. But thank you so much. That was a fascinating talk. And everyone go and order the book because everything that you quoted from it just sounds amazing. So
thank you. Thanks everyone for tuning in. And if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask me, please get in touch with me online. I'm always happy to answer questions and to be in touch with readers. Thank you so much. Have a great evening.
Thank you very much. It was very
Thank
interesting.
you. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.